Someone once said that when you choose your behavior, you choose your consequences, and sometimes bad behavior can lead to a very regretful consequence, such as spending the rest of your life in jail. And if you're absolutely terrible, that time in prison will end in a death sentence, a fate that no one would want to endure. We're not here to discuss if this is an ethical treatment, whether for adults or minors. We're just here to give you a list of the 10 minors who were sentenced to death. Our first entry is James Terry Roach. In 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court reauthorized the use of the death punishment by states, and the second person to be executed by the state of South Carolina was a guy named James Terry Roach. But how did James end up there? Well, in 1977, he and his friend, if you can call him that, Joseph Carl Shaw, spent their day consuming illegal substances and driving around hoping to find people to hurt. No, I didn't stutter on that. This little quest led them to the killing of 2 innocent teenagers who were just going about their day. Of course, James and his friend got in trouble, rightfully so. The first person to receive their consequences was Joseph in 1985, and almost a year later, James Roach had to pay the consequences as well. He was strapped to an electric chair, even though his involvement in the incident was mostly due to his friend's bad influence. And that is how, at 25 years old, Roach finally paid the price for a crime he committed when he was only 17. His last words were, "I love you," and he dedicated them to the family and friends he left behind. How touching. Our next convict is Dalton PREJEAN. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court made a landmark decision that said it was unconstitutional to impose the death penalty on anyone under 18. This is known as the Roper v. Simmons ruling, and before that, only 22 people were executed in the U.S. for crimes that they committed as minors. One of these 22 was Dalton PREJEAN, a man who was taken to the electric chair when he was 30, for a crime that he committed when he was only 17. But after some evaluations, it was determined that PREJEAN had mental issues, and he was a black man judged by an all-white jury. I think you can see where that part's going. The trial seemed pretty unfair. However, because it was friggin' Louisiana, they didn't consider these matters and went on to prosecute and charge this man for the murder of a police trooper. Given the background and severity of this case, it naturally got attention from everyone around the world. Our next dead man walking is Johnny Frank Garrett. Halloween can be spooky and fun at the same time. I'm looking forward to my Halloween party this year in particular. But sadly, it's also a day in which many criminal acts happen. Kinda like the murder of a Catholic nun. And that's exactly what happened on October 31st of 1981. The crime was committed by a guy named Johnny Frank Garrett, who lived across the street from the convent when the nun was killed. It took 9 days for Garrett to get arrested, and then he became a death row prisoner even though he wasn't even 18. A hearing was held to determine whether Garrett would serve life in prison instead of receiving a death sentence, but his sentence was retained and he was finally executed by lethal injection when he was 28. His last meal request was ice cream, and some people say that his last words were, "I'd like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. The rest of the world can kiss my..." We're a family channel, so I can't say that word. Poetic, though. Our next end-of-lifer is Curtis Paul Harris. Do you know what a Good Samaritan is? It's the name given to someone who steps out of their way to help someone in need. And that's exactly what motorist Timothy Merca did when he pulled over to help a pair of brothers who were in need. Though instead of thanking him for his kindness, the brothers hurt Mr. Merca. Their names were Danny and Curtis Harris. Mr. Merca pleaded for his life while Danny held him and Curtis clubbed him with a tire iron. Not only did they kill the man, but the brothers also stole Mr. Merca's possessions. Both brothers were sentenced to death, even though Curtis was only 17 when the incident happened. This unfortunate event happened in Texas, and the case became known as the Good Samaritan slaying. Our next terrible person is Steve Edward Roach. Steve Edward Roach was friends with a lady called Mamie Estes. Steve would help her with everyday chores, such as chopping wood and cutting the grass. Seemed like a nice friendship, actually. And that's why it was quite shocking to find out that Steve ended up killing Mamie's sister, Marianne, on December 3rd, 1993. Marianne was hanging out in front of her house when suddenly she was shot. It took a day for the authorities to discover her body. Right after the incident, Steve took Marianne's car and fled Virginia, which is the state where they lived. He went to North and South Carolina, and that became evident when the authorities found out that someone had been trying to use a dead woman's bank card at an ATM in North Carolina. The ATM's videotape was used as evidence, and on December 6 of 1993, Steve finally turned himself in. He recorded a confession and said that he took Mary Ann's car and purse. When asked about the killing, Steve said that he didn't know why he did it. Our next person who wasn't loved enough as a child is Ruben Cantu. Ruben Cantu was a guy from San Antonio, Texas who got involved in very bad situations since he was young. At the age of 15, he became one of the leaders of an organized auto theft ring. He had his own band of bad kids called the Gray Eagles. Eventually, though, Cantu was involved in a crime that sentenced him to death. However, when you put this story together, you realize that the guy might have been innocent of the charges that led him to his death. In 1994, two guys went into a house under construction and attacked two men who were staying inside the house as guards. One of the victims died, and the one who survived had to identify the people who killed his co-worker. They showed him photos of many people, including Cantu, but the victim did not recognize him as the one of the people who were involved in the crime. But after trying multiple times, he finally pointed at a photo of Cantu and said that he was the one who shot him and his working partner. Cantu was charged and sentenced to death, and he died in 1993 by lethal injection. Years later, the victim confessed that the person who shot him didn't look anything like Cantu. The sentence Cantu received was quite unfair, but he was involved in many bad things. But there wasn't enough proof to say that he had killed someone. Or, killed someone yet. Our next special little angel is Sean Sellers. Most of the people on this list were 17 years old when they were sentenced to death. They were almost 18 when they committed their crimes, but Sean Sellers is different. He killed 3 people before he even turned 17. In fact, 2 of them were his mother and stepfather, who were asleep when he decided to take their lives. He only wore underwear to avoid getting blood splattered all over his clothes, and he set up the crime scene in a way that would make it look as if an intruder had broken in and killed them. However, he couldn't get away with that. He was caught and also confessed to killing a Circle K employee who refused to sell him beer. During the trials, he gained a lot of attention, mainly because of his young age, but also because he blamed the killings on dark voices inside his head that led him to commit the crimes. He then claimed that he converted to Christianity while he was in prison, but none of that stopped him from getting the lethal injection. Our next totally innocent party is Charles Francis Rumbaugh. Charles Francis Rumbaugh became a criminal at the age of 6, and by 12 he was already committing armed robberies. Parents just must be so proud. One day at the tender age of 17, he walked into a jewelry store in Amarillo, Texas, and got into a heated exchange that resulted in the shooting of the store's owner, Michael Fiorello. In 1985, Charles received the lethal injection as a consequence of his actions. And at that point in history, he became the first juvenile offender for 21 years to be executed in the USA. After the 1976's decision regarding capital punishment, he was the first of 22 offenders under 19 who were tried and prosecuted before the laws were changed in 2005. Now it's time for today's best pick. The picture chosen for today shows the face of someone who ends up in jail recently. His name is Cameron Herron, and he's now 21 years old. But 3 years ago, when he was only 18, he drove the car that killed a mother and her baby. And that earned him the terrifying sentence of life in prison. Oh crud, he's not supposed to be on this list. I got a new one though, don't worry. Today's worst pick is Paula Cooper. Paula Cooper was the youngest person ever sentenced to death in Indiana. She received her sentence after confessing to her involvement in the murder of a 78-year-old teacher. And at only 15 years old, Paula became the youngest person on death row in the nation. That's why her case gained so much attention. In 2004, during an interview, Paula said that she regretted the crime that she committed, and it seemed like she understood the importance of rehabilitation, but she also understood that the true path to recovery could only be achieved once she was ready for it. Mind you, that's without anybody forcing her. During her time in prison, Paula got a college degree and got to work with assistance dogs to get them ready to work with people. She was actually so good that she even mentored other students, and eventually the US Supreme Court barred the death penalty for juvenile offenders. Paula's sentence was reduced to 60 years in prison, but in 2013, Paula was released when she was in her early 40s. Unfortunately, 2 years later, she was found dead. Apparently, she decided to take her own life. Before we move on, do me a favor. My analytics show that only about 15% of you watching are actually subscribed. Come on guys, what's up with that? Can you guys please hit the subscribe button? You guys watch my videos every day anyway, so you might as well subscribe and keep up to date with every video we put out. And then there's cases like our last one of George Junius Stinney Jr. We finish our video with George Stinney. He was only 14 when he was accused of hurting an 11-year-old girl named Betty June Binnicker and a 7-year-old named Mary Emma Thames. After the two failed to return home, the bodies of these girls were found in the ditch near the village of Alcolu in South Carolina. Starting to notice a pattern here with South Carolina. In June 1944, George was sentenced to death and put in an electric chair, which made him the youngest American to ever endure such a punishment during the 20th century. Sadly, though, more than 70 years after the incident in 2014, the case was invalidated as an unfair trial. It said that George had been with his sister at the time that the police established the murders, but back then the authorities were quick to make accusations and apparently got the wrong guy. Also, let's be honest here, it's the 40s, racism was far more rampant. Also, as proven in my serial killers list with Jeffrey Dahmer, police back then can be pretty friggin' stupid. Criminal actions can have severe consequences, but sometimes those consequences are aimed at the wrong person. While there were some deserved killings today, like the last couple of two, they were misjudged. Let's just hope that we don't have more cases like this in the 21st century and that kids today learn from the past to be better in the future. What did you think of these stories? Let us know in the comment section down below. And with all that said and done, that's our video for today, folks, and I will see you all next time. Later, everybody.